Hi, Max Brantley with the Arkansas Times on Tuesday, November the 22nd, back in Little Rock after a trip over to Meany yesterday. Glad to be back home. The news is Donald Trump and more Donald Trump as always as the president-elect finds his way in office. The news was made early this morning when Donald Trump, through a spokesman, said that he had no intention of calling for a further investigation of Hillary Clinton on either use of her email server as Secretary of State or of the Clinton Foundation. Of course, there had been no evidence of any wrongdoing, quite the contrary in both cases, but he promised to investigate her during the campaign, and his supporters chanted ceaselessly to lock her up. Well, his morning Kellyanne Conway said there'd be no investigation. The problem with Donald Trump is you never know from minute to minute whether what he says is true or not, or whether he'll stick with it later. Later in the day, Trump had a meeting with the New York Times editorial board and reporters and was asked that question directly, and he said, why, no, he didn't necessarily mean he would not investigate them. Indeed, if there is evidence of crime, of course, they should be investigated. There is none. Some of this, I think, was just a cover-up for a very big story about Donald Trump's own foundation. He filed a report for 2015 that admitted the foundation had dealt in self-dealing, which is prohibited by the IRS tax code, not only in 2015, but perhaps in past years. You can recall Washington Post reporting that talked about him spending foundation money, which enjoys tax privilege status, on things that benefited his business and paid off debts of his business and put paintings in his business of himself. So this may have been yet just another PR ploy to sound nice about the Clintons, to cover up some noise about his own problems. Back in Arkansas, they're talking about budget cuts. The governor's talking ceaselessly about removing people from the payroll. A health task force meeting this morning at the Capitol talking about tens of millions of dollars in savings from a different way of approaching Medicaid reimbursements. What they haven't talked about much in terms of saving money is what this means in lost services. There almost certainly has to be some reduction in services. This will not all be saved by efficiencies in cutting fraud and race, despite what you might think. One thing the legislature almost certainly will not take up in 2017 is something that was suggested by President Obama's Education Secretary, John King. He's written the 15 states that still explicitly allow corporal punishment, one of those is Arkansas, and encouraged them to end the practice. It's not effective as a disciplinary tool, and it tends to be used disproportionately against minority students. Arkansas likes its corporal punishment. We're third in the country in its use, although about half the schools in Arkansas don't use it, but where it is used a lot. Spare the rod is what you hear Arkansas legislators all the time, and they don't intend to do it. Also, something you can expect in the legislature in 2017 is more efforts to limit the medical rights of women. The Family Council, the ultra-white, right-wing so-called religious organization, has announced its plans to introduce a number of anti-women legislative bills that would restrict the right to abortion, effectively ban it, really. They're going to include a proposal to prohibit use of medical abortions, that is, medicinal abortions, just by pill, in the very early stages of pregnancy, at a point so early some women won't know they're pregnant by the time that it's banned. This is just nothing but an end run around what is still a right to an abortion in the United States. There are other bad things in there about assisted suicide, some other medical limitations that likely will receive favor in the Arkansas legislature. One more piece of legislative news: David Hillman, just elected to a third term as a state representative from Arkansas County, has announced that he's going to no longer be a Democrat. He switched to the Republican Party. He says he needs to better serve the political interests of his constituents, all of whom voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. The Republicans now have a 75-vote unassailable margin in the State House of Representatives. One other bit of legislative news: our favorite Senator Jason Rapert announced today that he's now the CEO of something called ULockit. This is a company that sells door barricading devices to schools. The interesting thing about this company is they had to change the fire code in Arkansas over the objections of the fire marshal, who thought these devices were unsafe, so that they could be sold in Arkansas schools. Safety officials in other states have also complained these things are hard to use and can potentially create more harm than good if used in classrooms, but legislative pressure has also improved them in other states. When this company got off the ground, in addition to Jason Rapert, it had some other very well-known Republicans involved in the scheme, including Ted Thomas, now Public Service Commissioner and a former legislator himself. So we'll need to keep watching that. I thought Rapert had gone solely into the religion business out of getting out of securities, but he's also peddling a ULockit device. News from Jackson County: Prosecutor Henry Boyce announced a plea bargain today for a 20-year sentence for James Clay, and this solves a 49-year-old murder case. Clay and a deceased brother kidnapped and shot a man in North Little Rock to get a car while fleeing a burglary. They left him alive, handcuffed to a tree in Jackson County where he died. Eventually, Clay apparently told a fellow inmate where he was serving a prison sentence about the crime. One thing led to another, and finally justice was done. A charge was filed, and Clay has agreed to a second-degree murder conviction and 20-year sentence. He's 69. Perhaps he will end his life in prison. Fred Duhart, who was one of 5 people shot in a mass drive-by on Bragg Street November the 2nd, died over the weekend. That case is now a homicide. The Little Rock police still don't have a suspect in that quintuple shooting. And finally, the Broadway Bridge, one of my favorite topics. You remember it had to be torn down and replaced because it was just old and no good anymore. Well, it continues to resist efforts to tear it down. They tried to demolish the last concrete footing of the bridge yesterday. The job didn't get done, so they're not going to be able to float a second arch into place to complete the span over the river as quickly as they'd hoped. More demolition work is needed. That was one tough old bridge they built 100 years ago. It's been kind of fun watching them tussle with it. I'm Max Brantley. I'll be back to tussle tomorrow.